On a biting winter night, the streets of New York were silent except for the occasional whistle of the wind weaving through the alleys. George Anderson, an elderly millionaire with silver hair and an air of quiet determination, moved with purpose through a shadowed corner of the city. His hands were chilled despite his woolen gloves, but his heart felt strangely warm. For years, George had dedicated these nights to distributing food and blankets to the homeless, a gesture born from a deep grief that had long since hollowed his soul. As George navigated the icy pavement, his sharp eyes fell upon a frail figure huddled against the damp bricks of a narrow alley. The boy was curled up tightly, his oversized coat torn and caked with dirt. For a moment, George hesitated, the boy's stillness too reminiscent of something fragile, something he had once lost. Summoning his resolve, George knelt down, the cold seeping into his knees as he extended a steaming cup of soup and a few crisp bills toward the child. "Hey there, son," George said softly, his voice carrying both warmth and caution. "You look like you could use something hot. Take this, it'll help." The boy stirred slightly, his thin frame trembling from either the cold or fear. As George leaned in closer, the boy lifted his head. Pale, gaunt cheeks framed piercing blue eyes that froze George in place. Time seemed to collapse, and the years of sorrow that had weighed on him dissipated in a single breath. Those eyes, those unmistakable, wide, searching eyes. "Elliot," George whispered, the name escaping his lips before he could stop it. His chest constricted painfully. He had buried this face in his memories, the face of his grandson who had been declared dead in the same car crash that had taken his son and daughter-in-law 5 years ago. Yet here he was, alive but lost to a world of hardship. The boy blinked, confusion clouding his gaze. Who are you?" His voice cracked with both fear and unfamiliarity. George's heart shattered anew. Could it really be him? And if it was, how had he come to this wretched state? Questions rushed through George's mind like a storm, but he swallowed them, choosing instead to speak with the care of a man who had just found a fragment of his shattered life. "It's me," George said, his voice trembling. "It's Grandpa. I've been looking for you for so long." The boy flinched at the word. Grandpa. The title held a weight he couldn't yet understand. His frail body tensed, his instincts urging him to retreat. But something in George's eyes, desperation, warmth, and hope, kept him from fleeing. I don't remember," the boy whispered, his words so faint they barely reached George's ears. George felt tears sting his eyes, but he pushed them back, knowing now was not the time to break. The boy's condition spoke volumes. Wherever Elliot had been, whatever had happened, it had stripped him of his memories and his innocence. George's grief turned into resolve. "It's all right, son," George said, gently placing a protective hand on the boy's thin shoulder. "You don't have to remember everything right now. Let's get you somewhere safe and warm. We'll figure everything out together." For a long moment, the boy said nothing, his head hanging low. But finally, with a barely perceptible nod, he allowed George to help him to his feet. As they stepped out of the alley and into the muted glow of the city streets, George silently vowed that whatever it took, he would bring his grandson back to the life he deserved. Each step they took away from that alley was the beginning of a journey to uncover the truth and perhaps, finally, to heal the wounds left behind by the tragedies of the past. The wind howled through the streets as George guided Elliot down the uneven pavement, his arm wrapped protectively around the boy's frail shoulders. The weight of the encounter pressed heavily on George's chest, making each step feel more significant. He stole glances at the boy, his heart sinking further with every detail he noticed. The hollow cheeks, the dirt-streaked face, the oversized coat that barely clung to his thin frame. How had this happened? And why had no one found him before now? As they walked, George's thoughts spiraled back to the night of the accident, the phone call that had shattered his world. His son Daniel, his daughter-in-law Sophia, and his grandson Elliot had been declared victims of a devastating crash. He remembered standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking the wreckage, watching as flames consumed what remained of his family's car. Authorities had assured him that no one could have survived. Yet here Elliot was, alive and inexplicably alone. George shook his head, trying to silence the questions pounding in his mind. Now was not the time for answers. The boy at his side needed warmth, safety, and above all, reassurance. Just a little farther, George murmured, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. My car is nearby. I'll take you home. You'll be safe there. Elliot remained quiet, his small frame trembling against the biting wind. George guided him toward the waiting car, opening the door and ushering him into the heated interior. The boy hesitated for a moment, as though he wasn't sure whether he belonged there, before finally settling into the plush seat. As George started the engine, he glanced at Elliot through the rearview mirror. The boy sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on the floor. It was as if he couldn't bring himself to believe in the comfort being offered to him. It's all right, son, George said gently, his voice breaking the silence. We'll be home soon. The drive to the Anderson mansion was quiet, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional soft sound of Elliot's breathing. George's hands tightened on the steering wheel as they approached the sprawling estate. The sight of the house, a place that once brimmed with life, brought a familiar ache to his chest. It had been too quiet for too long, its halls echoing with the absence of the family he had lost. As they pulled into the driveway, the grand facade of the mansion loomed above them, its windows glowing faintly in the night. George stepped out of the car and opened the door for Elliot, who climbed out hesitantly, his wide eyes taking in the sight before him. This was your home, George said softly, his voice thick with emotion. And it still is. Come on, let's get you inside. Elliot followed him up the stone steps, his movements cautious and uncertain. George opened the heavy oak door, revealing the warm interior of the house. The scent of polished wood and faintly burning candles greeted them as they stepped inside. Welcome home, George said, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy stood frozen, his gaze darting around the grand foyer. There was something vaguely familiar in the way his eyes lingered on the staircase, the chandeliers, and the ornate rug that stretched across the marble floor. But he didn't say a word. George led him to the living room, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. He gestured toward the plush sofa. Sit here, Elliot. I'll get you something warm to drink. The boy hesitated before perching on the edge of the sofa, his small hands gripping the fabric tightly. George watched him for a moment, his heart heavy with a mix of relief and sorrow. In the kitchen, George prepared a cup of hot cocoa, the act both comforting and painful. He remembered making the same drink for Elliot when he was a child, back when the house was filled with laughter and warmth. Carrying the steaming cup back to the living room, he handed it to the boy. Here, George said softly. Drink this. It'll help warm you up. Elliot took the cup with trembling hands, his eyes darting up to meet George's for the briefest moment. Thank you, he murmured, his voice barely audible. George settled into the armchair across from him, watching as the boy sipped cautiously at the drink. He wanted to say so much, to ask 1,000 questions, but he knew he couldn't overwhelm the boy. For now, it was enough that Elliot was here, safe and under his care. Elliot, George began carefully, breaking the silence. Do you remember anything about how you got here? About the accident? The boy froze, his grip tightening on the cup. He shook his head slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know, he whispered. I don't remember much. Just being cold and hungry and alone. George felt his chest tighten. It's all right, he said quickly. You don't have to force yourself to remember. We'll take this one step at a time. You're safe now, and that's what matters. Elliot nodded faintly, his shoulders relaxing just a little. The firelight danced across his pale face, casting shadows that seemed to emphasize the weight he carried. George watched him silently, his heart aching with both love and determination. No matter what had happened, no matter what it took, he would protect this boy, and he would find the answers they both needed. The mansion was silent as George showed Elliot to the guest room. The space was warm and inviting, the bed covered in a thick quilt, and the walls painted a soft shade of blue. Elliot stepped inside hesitantly, his eyes scanning the room with a mixture of curiosity and unease. This room is yours now, George said gently, stepping aside to let the boy explore. Take your time getting settled. If you need anything, I'll be nearby. Elliot nodded, his gaze lingering on the bed as though it were a foreign object. He approached it slowly, running his fingers over the quilt. "It's soft," he murmured, almost to himself. George smiled faintly. "It's yours, son. You can rest here as long as you need." For a moment, Elliot seemed lost in thought. Then he turned to George, his expression hesitant. "Thank you," he said, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper. George stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me, Elliot. You're my grandson. I'll always take care of you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. Elliot's gaze dropped, and he nodded silently. George gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze before stepping back. "Good night, Elliot," George said softly. "I'll see you in the morning." As he closed the door behind him, George leaned against the wall, his hand pressed to his chest. The weight of the night's events was overwhelming, but beneath it all was a flicker of hope, a hope he hadn't felt in years. In the room, Elliot sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. The warmth of the room felt unfamiliar, almost foreign, after so many nights spent in the cold. As he lay down and pulled the quilt over himself, a sense of safety began to creep in, a fragile feeling, but one that was enough to let his eyes close and his breathing steady. Down the hall, George sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth doing little to soothe the storm in his heart. He stared at an old family photo on the desk, a photo of Daniel, Sophia, and Elliot, taken on the lawn of the mansion years ago. How did it come to this? George murmured to himself. The grief that had consumed him for so long was now mixed with questions, questions that demanded answers. He reached for the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. When the line connected, he spoke with quiet determination. "Thomas, it's George Anderson. I need your help. My grandson, he's alive. And I need to know why." The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Anderson mansion, casting a golden glow on the polished floors and ornate furniture. George sat in the kitchen, nursing a cup of black coffee. His thoughts were heavy as he prepared himself for the conversation that would inevitably follow. Upstairs, Elliot was still asleep, likely for the first time in days, or perhaps years, in a bed rather than on the unforgiving streets. The soft sound of footsteps broke George's reverie. He turned to see Elliot standing hesitantly in the doorway, wearing a set of clean clothes George had left for him. The boy looked better this morning, but his face still bore the marks of exhaustion and uncertainty. "Good morning, Elliot," George said with a warm smile. "Did you sleep well?" Elliot nodded slowly, his gaze darting around the kitchen as if trying to familiarize himself with the space. "It was quiet," he murmured, almost as if the stillness had unnerved him. "Well, that's what home should feel like," George replied, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Come sit. I had Mrs. Walker prepare some breakfast." Elliot hesitated before sliding into the chair. The table was laden with an assortment of food, pancakes, scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, and warm bread. The sight seemed to overwhelm him, and he sat stiffly, unsure of where to begin. "Eat as much as you like," George encouraged, his voice gentle. "You don't have to hold back." Elliot picked up a piece of toast, nibbling at it cautiously. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he were testing the reality of the moment. George watched him in silence, his heart heavy with both relief and sorrow. This boy, who should have been thriving, had spent years struggling to survive. "Elliot," George began carefully, not wanting to overwhelm him, "do you remember anything about how you ended up on the streets? Or about the accident?" The toast in Elliot's hand stilled. He stared at it for a long moment before shaking his head. "Not much," he said softly. "Just flashes. I remember being in a car. It was dark, and there was yelling. Then everything spun, and I woke up cold, alone." George leaned forward, his brows furrowed with concern. "Do you remember anyone with you? Your parents, maybe?" Elliot's lips pressed into a thin line. "There was a woman. She was crying. I think she told me to run. But I don't know if it's real or just a dream." George's heart clenched. He reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over Elliot's. "It's okay, son. You don't have to force yourself to remember everything now. These things take time. Elliot nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained. I want to remember, he said, his voice trembling. But I'm scared. What if it's something bad? George squeezed his hand gently. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore, Elliot. I promise you that. For the first time, Elliot looked up and met George's eyes. There was a flicker of trust there, fragile but growing. He nodded again, his small voice carrying a glimmer of hope. Okay, Grandpa. Later that day, George retreated to his study, the room that had become his refuge in the years since the accident. The shelves were lined with books and family photos, the latter serving as both a comfort and a reminder of the loss he had endured. He sat at his desk, a phone in hand, his fingers hesitating over the keypad. Finally, he dialed the number of the one man he trusted to help unravel this mystery, Thomas Reed. George, Thomas's steady voice greeted him. It's been a while. What can I do for you? George leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. Thomas, I need your help. My grandson, Elliot, he's alive. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Alive? George, that's incredible. But how? I thought he... So did I, George interrupted, his voice tinged with both relief and frustration. But I found him last night, living on the streets. He doesn't remember much about the accident or how he survived, and I don't know where to start. Thomas's tone shifted to one of professional focus. All right, tell me everything. From the beginning. George recounted the events of the previous night, sparing no detail. As he spoke, Thomas remained silent, listening intently. When George finished, the detective's voice was firm. First things first, we need to re-examine the accident. If Elliot survived, there's a chance something critical was overlooked in the original investigation. I'll go through the old reports and visit the crash site myself, and if we find something? George asked, his voice edged with both hope and fear. Then we figure out who or what put your family in this situation, Thomas replied. And why? George nodded, though Thomas couldn't see it. Thank you, Thomas. I don't know what I'd do without you. You do the same for me, Thomas said simply. I'll call you as soon as I have anything. After ending the call, George leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. His hands rubbed his temples as he tried to process the enormity of the situation. Somewhere out there, answers existed. Answers that could explain why Elliot had been left to suffer and why George had been made to believe his family was gone forever. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, George found Elliot sitting in the library, flipping through an old photo album. The boy's expression was a mixture of curiosity and sadness as he studied the pictures of a life he could no longer remember. Those were taken when you were just a baby, George said, stepping into the room. He pointed to a photo of a younger Elliot sitting in his father's lap, both of them laughing. Your dad, Daniel, used to say you had the biggest smile. Elliot touched the image lightly, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. I don't remember him, he said quietly, but I feel like I should. George sat down beside him, his voice gentle. It's all right, Elliot. Memory is a tricky thing. Sometimes it comes back when you least expect it. Elliot looked up at him, his eyes filled with both determination and doubt. Do you think we'll ever figure out what happened? Why everything went wrong? George placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. I do, he said firmly. We'll find the answers, no matter how long it takes. And whatever we find, we'll face it together. For the first time that day, Elliot allowed himself to lean into George's touch. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a fragile thread of connection that both of them desperately needed. As the night deepened, George vowed silently to himself that he would uncover the truth, no matter what it cost. For Elliot, for Daniel, and for the family he had lost, and perhaps, just maybe, could begin to rebuild. The morning dawned quietly over the Anderson mansion, its golden light filtering through the high windows and warming the otherwise somber atmosphere. George stood in the hallway, his eyes scanning the long row of doors as he contemplated the next step. He had spent the night piecing through fragments of the past, searching for any clue that might trigger Elliot's memory. Elliot emerged from his room, rubbing his eyes and dressed in the simple, comfortable clothes George had provided. "Good morning, Grandpa," he said shyly, his voice still hesitant, as though testing his place in this vast, unfamiliar house. "Good morning, Elliot," George replied with a smile that masked his unease. "Did you sleep well?" Elliot nodded faintly, but didn't say much else. The boy was still guarded, as if afraid to let down walls that years of hardship had built. "I thought," George said carefully, "we might explore some of the rooms today. There are parts of this house that might seem familiar to you. Maybe they'll help you remember." Elliot's expression was unreadable, but after a moment, he nodded. "Okay." George led him through the sprawling hallways, past doors that opened to forgotten rooms filled with dust and relics of a life that had once been vibrant. He pointed out old photographs on the walls, pausing to explain who each person was. Some of the faces sparked curiosity in Elliot, though his memories remained frustratingly out of reach. Finally, they stopped before a door at the end of a secluded hallway. The wood was darker than the others, its surface intricately carved with patterns that hinted at its importance. George hesitated, his hand resting on the brass handle. "This was your father's office," George said softly. "Daniel spent a lot of time here. He used to bring you inside sometimes, even though your mother thought you were too young to be around his work." Elliot's brow furrowed as he studied the door. "I think I remember this," he said slowly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I don't know why." George opened the door, and they stepped inside. The room was exactly as Daniel had left it. Shelves lined with books on finance and engineering, blueprints rolled up on a large oak desk, and a faint scent of aged paper lingering in the air. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating a framed photograph on the desk. Elliot walked toward it slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame. The image showed a smiling Daniel, Sophia, and a young Elliot standing in the mansion's garden. "They look so happy," Elliot murmured, his voice barely audible. "They were," George said, his throat tightening. "We all were." As Elliot continued to explore the room, his fingers grazed over a stack of papers and an ornate box tucked into the corner of the desk. "What's this?" he asked, pulling the box closer. George frowned, unsure. "I'm not certain. Your father kept many of his personal items here." Elliot opened the box carefully, revealing a collection of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The top letter bore Sophia's handwriting, the words smudged but still legible. "Daniel, I'm scared. There's something wrong, and I don't know if I can protect Elliot from it. Please, listen to me." Elliot read the words aloud, his voice trembling. George's heart sank as he realized the letter was a window into the turmoil that had consumed his family before the accident. "She was scared," Elliot said, looking up at George. "What was she scared of?" George took the letter gently, his eyes scanning the page. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy. "But this is a clue. Maybe Thomas can help us make sense of it." That afternoon, George met with Thomas Reed in the mansion's study, the letter and its cryptic message spread out on the desk between them. Elliot sat nearby, his wide eyes fixed on Thomas as though the detective might hold the key to unlocking his fragmented memories. "This changes things," Thomas said, his tone grim. "It's clear now that Sophia knew something. Something she believed was a threat to Elliot. But what kind of threat?" George asked. "And why didn't she tell me?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "From what we know so far, it seems she was trying to shield Elliot from something connected to Daniel. The accident might not have been an accident at all. It could have been orchestrated." Elliot stiffened in his seat. "Orchestrated? You mean someone wanted them dead?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "It's a possibility we can't ignore. There were inconsistencies in the original investigation, things that didn't add up. And now, with this letter, we have proof that Sophia was trying to act before it was too late." George felt a chill run down his spine. "But why take Elliot? If they wanted to hurt my family, why leave him alive?" "That's the question," Thomas said, his voice low. "Whoever was behind this must have had a reason to spare him. Or perhaps they thought he wouldn't survive on his own." Elliot's gaze dropped to the floor, his small hands clenched in his lap. "I remember being told to hide," he said suddenly. "Before the accident, someone was yelling, and I ran. I don't know where, but I ran until I couldn't anymore. George reached out, placing a comforting hand on Elliot's shoulder. You were brave, Elliot. You did what you had to do to survive. The boy looked up at him, his blue eyes filled with both fear and determination. But why didn't she come back for me? If my mom was trying to protect me, why did she leave me? The question cut deep, and George had no answer. He turned to Thomas, hoping the detective might offer some clarity. I'm working on finding Sophia, Thomas said. If she's still alive, she might be able to explain everything. But I'll need time. Take whatever time you need, George replied firmly. We need answers, Thomas. And if someone is responsible for what happened to my family, I want them brought to justice. Thomas stood, gathering the letter and his notes. I'll contact you as soon as I find anything. For now, try to focus on helping Elliot recover. He's been through more than most adults could handle. After Thomas left, George turned to Elliot, who was still seated in the study, his small frame dwarfed by the large chair. Elliot, George said gently, I know this is a lot to take in, but we'll figure it out together. I promise you, I won't rest until we know the truth. Elliot nodded slowly, his expression still troubled but resolute. I want to know what happened, Grandpa. I need to. And we will, George assured him. But for now, let's take it one step at a time. You're safe here, and you're not alone anymore. As they left the study, George placed a protective arm around Elliot's shoulders, silently vowing to uncover the truth no matter how painful it might be. The path ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would do whatever it took to protect his grandson and give him the life he deserved. The days following Thomas's visit passed in a blur of tension and quiet determination. George spent hours poring over old family records, photographs, and letters, searching for anything that might explain the cryptic message Sophia had left behind. Meanwhile, Elliot explored the mansion cautiously, his curiosity gradually overcoming his apprehension. One afternoon, as George sat in his study with a stack of old documents spread before him, Elliot entered the room holding something in his hands. It was a worn leather-bound book, its edges frayed with age. Grandpa, Elliot began hesitantly, I found this in the library. It was on a high shelf, hidden behind some other books. George set his papers aside and took the book, his brow furrowing as he flipped through its pages. It wasn't a book at all, but a journal, Sophia's journal. His pulse quickened as he scanned the entries, each one a glimpse into her thoughts during the months leading up to the accident. I was right, George murmured, his voice trembling. She was afraid. She knew something was coming. Elliot leaned closer, his wide eyes fixed on the pages. What does it say? George paused on a particularly revealing entry. I don't know who to trust anymore. Even Daniel refuses to listen. They're watching us. I can feel it. If anything happens to me, I need to make sure Elliot is safe. He's the only thing that matters. George read the words aloud, his voice heavy with emotion. Elliot's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. She thought Dad wouldn't listen? Elliot asked, his voice small. Why wouldn't he help her? I don't know, son, George replied, his heart aching. But whatever she was trying to protect you from, she believed it was real. As they continued reading, another entry caught their attention. This one was dated just days before the accident. There's no time left. I've hidden the files in a safe place, but I can't keep running. They'll come for us soon. If I can get Elliot to safety, it'll all be worth it. The files, George said, his eyes narrowing. What files? And where did she hide them? Elliot looked up at him, determination shining through his uncertainty. We have to find them. If Mom hid something, it must be important. George nodded, his mind racing. You're right. And those files might hold the answers we've been searching for. That evening, George and Elliot began their search for the files Sophia had mentioned. The mansion, with its many rooms and hidden corners, seemed an impossible place to start, but George's instincts told him to focus on the places Sophia had spent the most time. They started in the library, carefully inspecting shelves, drawers, and cabinets. Hours passed with no success, and Elliot's frustration began to show. What if they're not here? He asked, his voice tight with worry. What if we can't find them? George placed a reassuring hand on his grandson's shoulder. We will, Elliot. Your mother left that journal for a reason. She wanted us to find them. Just as they were about to call it a night, Elliot's eyes fell on a painting hanging above the fireplace. It was a portrait of Daniel and Sophia, smiling warmly as they stood side by side. Grandpa, Elliot said, his voice suddenly excited. Look at the frame. George turned to the painting and noticed what Elliot had seen. A small keyhole embedded in the ornate frame. His heart raced as he retrieved the key he had found among Sophia's belongings years ago. A key he had never been able to match to anything in the house. Carefully, he inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The painting swung open like a door, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Inside was a leather-bound folder, its edges worn but its contents intact. George pulled the folder out and opened it, revealing a stack of documents and photographs. As he scanned the pages, his breath caught in his throat. These are financial records, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But they're not Daniel's. They belong to someone else, someone who was funding a project through his company. Elliot leaned over the papers, his brow furrowing. What kind of project? George flipped through the documents, stopping at a blueprint labeled Project Haven. The name was unfamiliar, but the details were chilling. It described a facility built for purposes that were deliberately obscured, something about unregulated experimentation and human testing. This, George began, his voice shaking. This is why she was scared. Whoever was behind this was using your father's company to cover their tracks. And when she found out, they tried to silence her. Elliot finished, his voice trembling. And us. George nodded grimly. This wasn't an accident, Elliot. This was a cover-up. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the room. Elliot sat back, his small frame seeming even smaller as he processed the truth. So, Mom was trying to protect me from these people, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, George said firmly. And now it's up to us to finish what she started. We need to bring this to Thomas. He'll know what to do. As they packed up the documents, George watched Elliot carefully. The boy's face was a mixture of fear and determination, but there was also a glimmer of strength. Despite everything he had been through, he was willing to face the truth, no matter how dark it might be. You're brave, Elliot, George said softly. Braver than I ever could have been at your age. Elliot looked up at him, his blue eyes shining with unshed tears. I just want to understand, Grandpa. I want to know why they did this. And we will, George promised. Together, we'll uncover everything. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, grandfather and grandson sat side by side, their bond growing stronger with each passing moment. They knew the journey ahead would be dangerous, but for the first time, they had a sense of direction and the hope that justice could finally be served. The next morning, George wasted no time in contacting Thomas Reed. The detective arrived at the Anderson mansion just as the first rays of sunlight crept through the frost-covered trees. His expression was one of calm determination as George handed him the folder they had uncovered. These documents, George said, his voice steady but grim, are what Sophia was trying to hide. They point to something called Project Haven. It's tied to whoever was using Daniel's company as a front. Thomas flipped through the papers, his eyes scanning the details with a practiced precision. He paused at the blueprint labeled Project Haven, his jaw tightening as he studied it. This is bad, Thomas said finally. Whoever was behind this was operating on a scale far larger than anything we've encountered before. These financial records alone implicate several powerful entities, names I've seen in other investigations, tied to corporate corruption and even government dealings. George's heart sank. So, what do we do? How do we fight something this big? Thomas set the folder down, his gaze serious. We take this to someone who can't be bought, a journalist, someone willing to risk everything to expose the truth. But we need more than this. We need witnesses, solid proof that ties these documents to the people who orchestrated the accident. Elliot, who had been quietly listening from the corner of the room, spoke up. What about my mom? If she's alive, she might know more. Thomas nodded. If Sophia is still out there, she's the key. But finding her won't be easy. People like this don't leave loose ends. If she's alive, she's either in hiding or being silenced. The weight of the words hung in the air, but George refused to let despair take hold. Then we find her, he said firmly. Whatever it takes. Thomas spent the rest of the day cross-referencing the names in the documents with his own records, while George and Elliot stayed close, waiting for any new developments. As evening fell, Thomas looked up from his laptop, his expression unreadable. "I've found something," he said. "One of the names in these documents is linked to a private facility in upstate New York. It's registered under a shell company, but the financial transactions match those in the folder." George leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Do you think Sophia could be there?" "It's possible," Thomas replied. "If she's alive, she might be held there. But we can't just walk in. A place like this will be heavily guarded. We need a plan," George said, his voice resolute. "And I want to be involved. I won't sit here while my family is in danger." Thomas hesitated, but eventually nodded. "All right, but we need to do this carefully. If we're going to expose these people, we can't afford to make mistakes." 3 days later, under the cover of darkness, George, Thomas, and a small team of trusted allies approached the secluded facility. It was a stark, concrete building surrounded by high fences and patrolled by armed guards. George's breath fogged in the cold air as they waited for Thomas's signal. "Remember," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible, "we're here to gather evidence and find Sophia. No heroics." George nodded, his nerves taut but his resolve unshaken. Elliot had begged to come along, but George had insisted he stay at the mansion under the care of Mrs. Walker. He couldn't risk losing his grandson again. The team moved swiftly, disabling the outer security system and sneaking past the guards. Inside, the facility was eerily quiet, its sterile halls lit by flickering fluorescent lights. George's heart pounded as they navigated the maze of corridors, each step bringing them closer to the truth and to Sophia. Finally, they reached a locked door marked restricted access. Thomas worked quickly to bypass the security panel, and the door slid open with a hiss. Inside was a small room filled with computer monitors and filing cabinets. But it wasn't the files that caught George's attention. It was the figure slumped in the corner. "Sophia," George whispered, rushing forward. The woman looked up, her face pale and gaunt but unmistakably familiar. Tears welled in her eyes as she recognized him. "George," she croaked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "It's me," George said, kneeling beside her and taking her hand. "You're safe now. We've come to take you home." Tears streamed down Sophia's face as she clung to him. I thought I'd never see Elliot again. Is he all right?" "He's safe," George assured her. "He's at the mansion, waiting for you." Thomas interrupted, his voice urgent. "We need to move. Now." With Sophia's arm draped over George's shoulders, they made their way back through the facility, pausing only to collect as much evidence as they could carry. Alarms blared as they reached the exit, the guards finally realizing the breach. Shots rang out, but the team managed to escape into the cover of the forest, their mission successful. Back at the Anderson mansion, Elliot stood anxiously at the window, his small frame silhouetted against the glow of the fireplace. When the front door finally opened and George stepped inside with Sophia by his side, Elliot's eyes widened. "Mom?" he whispered, disbelief and hope warring in his voice. Sophia dropped to her knees, opening her arms wide. "Elliot, my baby." Elliot ran to her, throwing himself into her embrace as sobs racked his small body. "I thought you were gone," he cried. "I thought you left me." Sophia held him tightly, her tears soaking into his hair. "I never wanted to leave you," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought you were gone." George watched the reunion with tears in his own eyes, a deep sense of relief washing over him. For the first time in years, his family felt whole again. But as he looked at Sophia, he knew the battle wasn't over. "We have what we need," Thomas said quietly, placing a hand on George's shoulder. "But bringing them down will take everything we've got." George nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll do it. For Sophia, for Elliot, for Daniel. We'll make sure they never hurt anyone else again." The journey to justice had begun, and George knew it would be long and arduous. But with his family by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would uncover the truth and ensure that those responsible paid the ultimate price. The Anderson mansion was alive with an energy that hadn't been felt in years. For the first time, George, Sophia, and Elliot were under one roof, united in purpose. But the peace was fleeting. In the days following Sophia's rescue, the weight of the evidence they'd gathered from the facility began to press down on them. The documents revealed the depth of corruption and malice behind Project Haven, a shadowy operation involving human testing disguised as medical research. George sat in the study with Thomas, the desk between them piled high with papers, photographs, and blueprints. Sophia was nearby, pale but determined, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through her journal and pointed out connections that only she could see. They used Daniel's company as a front, Sophia said, her voice steady despite the fire in her eyes. He didn't know at first, but when he found out, he tried to pull away. That's when the threats started. Threats? George asked, his brow furrowing. Sophia nodded, her gaze distant. At first, they pressured him with lawsuits, audits, anything to make him compliant. But when he resisted further, they came after us. That night, she paused, her voice catching. That night, I knew they wouldn't stop until they silenced us. I told Daniel we had to run, but he thought he could reason with them. Thomas leaned forward, his expression grim. And the accident? It wasn't an accident, Sophia said firmly. They forced our car off the road. I was drugged. I barely remember what happened afterward. When I woke up, they told me Elliot was dead. They said it was my punishment for trying to expose them. George's fists clenched, anger burning through him. But Elliot survived, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Somehow, he survived. They underestimated him, Sophia said, her eyes softening as she looked at her son. He's stronger than they'll ever know. Elliot, sitting quietly in the corner, met her gaze. I just ran, he said softly. I didn't know what else to do. You did what you had to do, Sophia said, crossing the room to kneel before him. You're here, Elliot. That's all that matters. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Thomas worked tirelessly to organize the evidence into a cohesive narrative, one that could withstand the scrutiny of both the courts and the public. Sophia, despite her lingering trauma, played a crucial role in identifying key players within the organization, providing the names and connections they needed to tie everything together. Meanwhile, George took on the role of protector and strategist. He reached out to his old contacts, journalists, lawyers, and even sympathetic politicians, assembling a team that could help them navigate the storm that was about to break. We're not just exposing a few bad actors, Thomas warned during one of their late-night meetings. This is a network. They'll fight back and they'll fight dirty. I don't care, George replied, his voice resolute. They've taken too much from my family. It's time they answered for it. Elliot, determined to contribute, spent hours poring over the documents with Sophia, asking questions and piecing together fragments of his memory. One evening, as he and his mother sifted through photographs, he pointed to a face in one of the group shots. That man, Elliot said, his voice tinged with recognition. I've seen him before. Sophia's breath hitched. That's Dr. Adrian Miles, she said. He was one of the lead scientists on Project Haven. If we can find him, he might be the key to bringing the whole thing down. Thomas leaned over the photo, his expression sharpening. Then we'll find him. If he's involved, he won't be able to hide for long. Months later, the case was ready. Armed with irrefutable evidence, George and his team took the fight to the courts and the public. The revelation of Project Haven sent shockwaves through the nation, exposing the horrors of human experimentation and the corruption that had allowed it to thrive. The trial was a grueling affair, with the defendants' lawyers attempting to discredit every piece of evidence and every witness. But Sophia's testimony, raw and unflinching, became the turning point. They tried to take everything from me, Sophia said, her voice echoing through the courtroom. But they underestimated a mother's love. They underestimated my family. And today, we're here to show them that they cannot escape justice. The courtroom was silent as her words hung in the air, a testament to her strength and resilience. George watched from the gallery, his heart swelling with pride. When the verdict was finally delivered, guilty on all counts, a wave of relief washed over them. The leaders of the organization were sentenced to life in prison, their empire dismantled piece by piece. Back at the Anderson mansion, the atmosphere was one of quiet celebration. The fight was over, but the scars remained. George, Sophia, and Elliot sat together in the garden, the sun setting over the sprawling lawn. "We did it," Sophia said softly, her hand resting on Elliot's shoulder.
"We stopped them."
Elliot looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a maturity beyond his years. "Does this mean we can finally be a family again?" "Yes," George said firmly. "This is a new beginning for all of us." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, their bond stronger than ever. The pain of the past would never fully disappear, but it had given them a purpose, a reason to fight, to survive, and to rebuild. And in that moment, under the vast expanse of the heavens, they knew that their journey had not been in vain. Together, they had turned tragedy into triumph, proving that even in the face of the darkest shadows, the light of love and resilience could prevail.